My name is Moni Hill. I work for I Have the Right To. I'm the programming director. I Have the Right To is an organization based in Washington, D.C., whose primary mission and vision is so that one day we can look back and say, I can't believe students were ever sexually assaulted at schools and then told to be quiet about it. That just like smoking on airplanes now, we can't believe that was ever a thing that was commonly accepted. We want sexual assault and harassment of all students to be such a thing we couldn't even comprehend happening. And so we primarily work with schools. I'd like to introduce Amy Carpenter of Be Strong, Be Wise. She's based in Maine. Her work with high schools and colleges and organizations such as Mainly Girls and Girls Inc. incorporates the safety tools of Be Strong, Be Wise that enhance personal and group awareness, supporting healthy relationships for young people from all walks of life. She's a longtime youth advocate. She believes that every person deserves to learn how to create healthy partnerships and avoid toxic ones. Her 2 books in the Be Strong, Be Wise series explore sexual ethics in straightforward terms that build self-confidence in young people and confidence in adults. She's a best-selling author, an educator, and psychotherapist with over 25 years of experience. And these 2 books are fantastic, and they really make it easy for adults and students to begin this hard work. Amy, thank you for being here.
You're so welcome. Thank you, Moni. Thank you for that beautiful introduction. And I love to enter into conversation, and so I'm excited for our Q&A, and where we all get to come to the table, because anybody who knows a teenager, parents a teenager, or works with a teenager is an expert on teenagers. So we all come to the table from that place.
I was reviewing one of your books this morning, and I pulled out a quotation from you. It said, I discovered the hard way that avoiding uncomfortable topics in order to keep one's child in the innocence zone underprepares that child for the real world. I do believe that a lot of us operate on fear and don't want to have these conversations with our kids. So I'm so glad that you're here to help us do these hard things, make them easier. So could you tell us a little bit about yourself and how you came to write your books? What need were you hoping to fill?
Well, I started much the same way you did, unfortunately, in that I had a personal experience involving my daughter, who was then 17. And I won't go into the details. The story is in both of my books, and she's bravely offered to have the story be shared so that people could learn from it. But I realized that I had fallen into what I believe now is a bit of a trap. I did not think of it as that way then, but I have observed, and I include myself in this observation, that we parent our children under a certain model currently, and this is not everybody, but I think it's a very common model that focuses on a child's comfort and happiness. The technical term would be child-centered parenting. People look at it different ways. Some people are calling it snowflake culture. There's lots of different ways of exploring our current parenting model. But when it came to my personal experience, what I realized after the event that was hugely emotionally upsetting, as I'm sure it was for you, Moni, you just can't begin to describe what that's like as a parent. But I realized that there were certain blind spots that I was functioning with around how to talk to my child about sexual safety. And I'm a survivor myself. I've been working in trauma treatment for 20 plus years. And I think that was also an obstacle for me because I was so worried that something like this would happen to her after all the horrible stories I'd heard in my practice, that I was really over-functioning in the worry department and under-functioning in the proactive department when it came to having really important conversations. So when that happened, I began, and I had already been researching and writing on this issue because I was, of course, working with survivors. Um, but that helped me look at it from a whole different perspective and realize that, we need more work on prevention. We have an awful lot of incredible resources around trauma response, but we don't have enough around prevention. And so I began to do a lot of research and really tried to find something that I could actually offer my child who was then getting ready to go to college. And I found very, very little that actually talks to teenagers about the teenage experience. There's lots of articles about consent and bystander intervention and statistics and date rape drugs and so forth, but really something that was more comprehensive, I couldn't find it. And I just started to, get kind of obsessed, to be honest, with researching and writing. And of course, a couple of years later, we have these 2 books. But that's really how it all began. And so I feel really passionate when I say, like, we're all experts. Anybody who works or parents a teenager is an expert. So we all have to kind of come to a common ground, a mutuality in talking about this.
What do you mean when you say sexual ethics? What is that?
That's a great question. And I'll share what I understand, and what I say when I do talks to teens and when I have conversations like this. I understand sexual ethics as going beyond the birds and the bees of traditional sex education. And as a side note, our sex ed in America is vastly under supported, underexplored. Only 10 states in America provide sex education that's medically accurate. We have a lot of ground to cover in making a robust sex education curriculum available for children and teens. So, however, sexual ethics, which I would argue would need to be added to sex ed curriculum, I like to think of it as the garden where the birds and the bees exist. So how does everybody get along in the garden? How do they communicate boundaries? How do they share space? How do they respect each other? That's how I like to describe it, because I think it's an image that people can work with, because we know the garden isn't looking very much like a garden these days. So, how to begin to create that awareness would be an empowering thing no matter what. Whether we're talking about romantic relationships or we're just talking about an awareness of oneself in the world.
So you talk about strengthening the language, right? Creating a new language. And we often talk about creating the fluency around consent. So it really is a new way of gardening or learning how to communicate about what's going on in the garden. I love metaphors, so I'll just use yours. For instance, I didn't even know what to tell my daughters when they were in school. They're 21. I didn't know. I just hoped the teachers do it. They hoped I would do it. And so here we are, and nobody's talking to the kids. And I am so glad, for books like yours that give me the words to use. So now I am fearless in talking to teenagers. I will talk to anybody about any of it. And it's thanks to you all. And I love that notion that we all are learning this language for the first time. What have you observed in your work with parents and schools as far as obstacles to discussing sexual ethics and safety with teens?
Well, there's a lot of them.
A lot of obstacles?
A lot of obstacles, I think. I mean, I mentioned one earlier. I think that we need to get more comfortable with uncomfortable subject matter. So that's an obstacle. Our own personal fear, using my own example, my own history as a survivor informed my parenting. So our own history, we need to get really clear on our own experience of sexual violence. Most women have an experience of sexual violence, even if it's, as a threat when you're walking down the street or, somebody grabbing you. Most women have these experiences, and we are so used to it in our culture, we don't think about how that affects our lives. So really doing a personal inventory, I think, is an important step and removes an obstacle for adults. I think teenagers, I have so much compassion for what teenagers are dealing with currently and the obstacles that they're living with. One of the obstacles that I'm hearing a lot of teens talk about particularly is cancel culture. And I'm still understanding cancel culture, but what I understand of it's another way of talking about peer pressure. But it's when you're basically ostracized by your peers or shunned or rejected by your peers because of a certain thing that you do or say. And this can be as minor as the type of clothing that you're wearing. It can be as impactful as taking a right action in behalf of someone else's safety. I could share a story. I'll try and share a story real quick because I share this story whenever I can. So I was given a story by a young man named Jake. That's not his real name. Jake was a college sophomore when this story happened, and he was attending an Ivy League school. He was a soccer player. He was on a fraternity, really popular. One Saturday night, the fraternity had a party. Everybody was drinking, as often happens. Alcohol, one of the main variables affecting assault outcomes. So this one woman was extremely intoxicated, and her friends that she arrived to the party with all left her. So here's another obstacle: ingrained sexism, because when boys get drunk, we think it's funny and kind of rowdy and humorous. When girls get drunk, we think it's gross and we leave them alone. So what happened to this girl is that she was intoxicated. She was left aside by her friends. And Jake observed this and said, "This is not good." So he called an Uber, and she could barely walk, but he escorted her into the Uber and took her to the hospital. He could have left her at the hospital because he had already done the right thing, but he stayed with her for hours until she had her stomach pumped and was medically examined and so forth. And he told her when she woke up that the reason he stayed with her is because he said, "I wanted the first thing for you to hear to be that you were not assaulted.
Yeah.
I didn't want you to have 1 minute of fear about that." So it still gives me chills to think of this story. So here's a guy who takes the champion step, right? He does the right thing. But here's what happens. He goes back to his school. His roommate, his teammates, his fraternity brothers, and his coach all came down on him and said, "Dude, what were you thinking? She could have accused you of assault, and you could have ruined your whole athletic career." So that is just an example of the kind of damned if you do, damned if you don't decision-making process that exists within cancel culture.
So how does Be Strong, Be Wise approach these obstacles in a way that allows teens to receive the necessary information regarding their own well-being and the well-being of their friends and partners?
I will try and be concise. Well, one of the things that we're committed to is creating individual awareness in each student. So the whole course is cumulative, and it starts with a really broad lens view of gender and culture, because the forces that affect women, men, and non-binary teens are going to be different. So we look at the definition of sexual assault. We look at the scope of the problem currently, because one of the things that I find really effective in working with teens is starting with a join up. And we know with young people, you got to get them to buy in to whatever you're doing. So the way that we do that in our program is we start with an objective fact that's inarguable. And we did this yesterday in the assembly. So we start with some of the statistics currently around the culture for teens and the level of violence and harassment that teens are living with. And it's fairly mind-blowing to look at the statistics because the Department of Ed has, of course, reported that no other demographic in our country is more at risk of assault than teenagers by other teenagers. So I hope that makes sense.
Yeah.
Yes. So teenagers committing assault against other teenagers. This is the demographic most at risk. And when you begin to say that kind of stuff, you're going to get a lot more interest. You're going to get a lot more of a captivated audience. And then you can begin to look at, all right, well, how does that apply to gender and culture? And then we begin to look at peer support. which is a really important part of our program. How do young people keep other young people safe? How do friends work together? And I'll often share a story from the Netherlands. The Netherlands has the lowest assault rate in the world. 7 out of 1,000 people will be assaulted in the Netherlands. That compares to 1 in 4 women in the US, 1 in 10 men. So it's astounding the difference between these two stats. What are they doing in the Netherlands? Well, they know that teenagers are going to be interested in sex. There's something that goes on in America where we think that's weird, or we don't know how to talk about it, or we pretend it doesn't exist. It's like teenagers are interested in sex. That's a fact. So if we meet that fact head on, and we also recognize they don't have a frontal lobe yet, they don't have executive functioning yet, how can we create discretionary thinking before the brain development has caught up? I would say we do that by giving all the information that we can, which is why we start with objective facts, and then asking the right questions to get teenagers to think for themselves about how they want to be in the world, how they want to conduct themselves in relationships, how they want to communicate, how they want to listen to their intuition. There are ways to build that muscle. We just have to get them thinking about it. So that's
is that what they're doing in the Netherlands?
So I'll tell you one thing they're doing in the Netherlands. They normalize sex, and they also recognize that because that is a fact, conversations at home happen, conversations in school happens, and everybody's aware that we're talking about a demographic not super known for making good choices. So how do you protect yourself? How do you protect your friends? And when they go out for an evening, they all go out on their bicycles, because that's what they do in the Netherlands. They ride their bikes. They all go out on their bikes, and they all come home on their bikes. So they stay together like a herd. So how to develop what I call herd consciousness, like be aware that when you go out for an evening, that's not just your friend group. That's also like your power group. You're there to help each other make good choices. If somebody looks uncomfortable, step in and help them out. If one of your friends is super intoxicated, like the story I just shared, step in and help her out. Don't ignore her and leave her there. That's when assaults happen. So, that kind of thing is really important for teenagers to hear as well.
So how did you leave the assembly? If you open it up with the facts, what do you leave them with?
Well, my number one goal, which is always my number one goal, is to get people talking. So my number one goal for that group of students was, talk to each other. If you can talk to your parents, if you can talk to your teachers or counselors, that's great. But for sure, talk to each other. You guys are the experts in your own life. I try and be very respectful. A teenager, if you are remotely doubting their intelligence, can smell it a mile away. So I do a lot of really speaking to what I call their wise mind, like their inner wisdom, their inner integrity. I try and speak to that part of them. So we did a lot. We covered a lot in the assembly, but that was one of the primary things that we left with. And I wanted them, we also looked at pornography right before the end, because I wanted that to be fresh in their minds. And of course, communicating and respecting boundaries. That was one of the things we left with as well.
So you leave the students feeling, talking about boundaries and thinking about things in different ways. How do you hope how it lands on the teachers and adults? Like, I know the assembly wasn't for them, but if you have some of us gathered, like, how do you leave us knowing that the problem is so rampant?
Yeah.
How do we even begin to have a conversation? Does it even matter?
Yeah. Well, I'll say something that I also say in our course, and I also said yesterday at the assembly, and I think teenagers really need to hear it, and we adults need to hear it, is that the statistics are still in their favor, that it is more likely they will not experience assault than that they will. That's a really important thing to know. Our goal in our course is to help teens be informed, not afraid. So all that we give them, all the tools, all the information is about informing them and creating that inner wisdom and that inner emotional intelligence. But I think we all have to remember, like, the statistics are still in their favor. We're just trying to help those odds. I've given a couple of tips. I think making sure to talk about the definition of sexual assault, making sure to develop a script, asking questions like, what do your friends do when you go out to keep each other safe? Having an understanding around alcohol is so important. Teenagers of all genders are losing their virginity under the influence of alcohol more than ever before. And I get that from Peggy Orenstein's work. I'm sure that most of you have heard of her work. She wrote Boys and Sex and Girls and Sex. Unbelievable resource as far as what's happening for teens currently. But alcohol is huge. People are getting more blackout drunk than they used to. They're losing their virginity to alcohol. Alcohol is a very normal component to a sexual encounter for teenagers. Why is that? My theory is that, and I would bet there's a study to prove it, but I haven't found it yet, because of the influence of pornography and peer pressure and this basic like sexualizing of the self. If you have 13-year-old girls, who I've heard a number of 13-year-old girls tell me this, receiving requests for nude pictures every week, you are seeing yourself as a sexualized being before any part of you has caught up with that. You have no idea what that's about, and yet somebody is seeing you and naming you and targeting you as a sexual being when you still could be playing with Barbie dolls. So it is tremendous pressure that teens are under in managing all of this. No wonder they're turning to alcohol. I guess I have to go have sex because that's what everybody's doing. Let me go get drunk. That will make it easier. And of course, how much of a satisfying experience is that going to produce? So talking about alcohol, what's your code of conduct? I hear a lot of boys say, and I give them credit every time, they will say, I don't engage in a sexual activity when I'm under the influence of alcohol. I just don't do it. I don't want to be accused of assault. I don't want to experience assault. And again, that's a champion step. I would love to hear more teenagers say that.
Yeah.
But talking to our teens about that kind of stuff, what's your own plan for how to manage peer pressure around alcohol and peer pressure around sex?
So I think your gift to parents, for me, is the way you model asking these open-ended questions where teens can use their wise mind and reflect. And many of us don't even know the questions to ask, and we don't want to traumatize our kids with a question, but I think that there are ways that what you're showing me, there are ways to engage in these very meaningful conversations that I think our teenagers want to have. I mean, they're having them with each other. I think they actually will not reject us when we say, hey. And a couple other tips you have is look for the right time, not a stressful moment. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So do you mind if I kind of wrap up giving
Feel free. I just want to say, Moni, before you go through that list, I agree with you completely, and teenagers are saying that. In fact, there are, research has been done on what teenagers believe around cyber safety, because that's, since the pandemic, cyber harassment, cyberbullying went up like 70%, like crazy numbers. Teenagers are saying nobody's handling this. Social media companies, politicians, teachers, parents, nobody's handling this well. The problem that I think we have to respectfully remind them is that they're not telling us when they get the requests for nude pictures and so forth and so on, and they're not necessarily reporting. So we really have our work cut out for us in encouraging teens to report really hard, really tough. When you're, again, cancel culture, peer pressure, nobody wants to be a snitch. But for sure, when it comes to talking about this stuff, they want the conversation.
So I would just like to wrap up by saying that I think everyone is welcome to reach out to you, right? Email you if
Yeah.
they, or get, these books have a lot of the example questions that we can ask teens, ways for us to engage with our teens.
Yeah.
They are invaluable resources. And I just, again, I'm walking away more motivated, more hopeful, and also, you know, thank you for reminding us that we do need to speak to our teens and our children for the lovely, remarkable beings that they are, and they are ushering in a new world. They're helping us so much, and so to remember that every time we engage with them. So this work requires so much humility and courage, and I think I'm so glad to have all of you involved. And Amy, thank you for your guidance.
You're so welcome. You're welcome.